Hi, friends, and welcome again to Jen and Matt Talk About the Bible. We are continuing on in our tiny mini-series of parables about the kingdom of heaven, a mini-series of 2. So this week we are looking at the parable of the sheep and goats, and this is found Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. So I'm going to get Matt to read this parable out for us, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. Jesus is talking about himself, right? So when he says Son of Man, he's talking about himself. And he's basically establishing himself as like the king, right? So he's sitting on a throne. So separating sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." And they will also answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it for me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteousness into eternal life.
Okay.
There we go.
That's great.
Why is Jesus so judgy? Isn't Jesus supposed to be meek and mild and nice and all about love and stuff?
I don't know. All I have recently is the image of Jesus flipping tables, so that's my Jesus.
Okay, well, yeah, I actually think a whole bunch of people, like, maybe this isn't as prevalent anymore, but I think there's a lot of people that are like, oh, like the God of the Old Testament is always angry.
Right.
And we love the God of the New Testament. It's like, have you read what Jesus says?
Maybe not. Yeah, why is he so judgy? I mean, like, I guess this is kind of summarizing about the parables of the kingdom of heaven. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this.
Yeah.
So there's something for us to, I guess, look forward to is the judgment. We want judgment to happen.
Do we?
Well, we think we do.
Yeah.
But that leads me to wonder. So Jesus is talking about the shepherd, and that the shepherd will separate the sheep and the goats. So I guess, like, what's that about? Like,
I don't know. I'm not a shepherd, so I don't really know.
That's fair.
Like, I'm assuming that it's like this is a normal thing that shepherds would do, is separate out the sheep from the goats. Like, is that, I don't know.
Do they fight
That seems
one
like
another?
a thing.
I feel like goats are pretty rambunctious. Maybe they damage the sheep or spook them.
I think it's just, I think maybe we play up a little too much that this is the parable of the sheep and the goats. There's not actually much, I don't find that there's much parable here.
No, it's
like,
pretty direct.
There's, like, are we parallel to sheep and goats? Like that, it's more that there's this separation where he's separating out the people, and they're not that, and there's other parables too, where it's like, there's a separation that happens at the end, and it's not always like distinguishable who's who. Like maybe that's it, but sometimes you can't really easily tell the difference. Like sheep and goats, you should be able to tell the difference, don't you think? I don't know.
I feel like you should.
This is your sermon. You're going to have to research that.
And I shall. Being a shepherd.
The thing that always strikes me about this, I guess we're going to call it a parable.
Sure.
I mean, because it is a parable. The thing that strikes me is that the righteous and the unrighteous, neither of them know what's going on. So when Jesus says, oh, I was hungry, you gave me something to eat, I was a stranger, you welcomed me, etc., etc., the righteous say, what? Like, when did we ever do that for you? And the same thing happens with the people, with the unrighteous. He says, when I was hungry, you didn't give me anything to eat, and when I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink, etc., etc. And they say, what? When did we ever not do that for you?
Okay, so might the parable connection point of the sheep and the goats actually be the fact that, like, if the sheep are the righteous and the goats are the unrighteous,
sure,
both of them are following the shepherd?
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
Because I feel like sometimes I read this as the unrighteous are like, what are you talking about, Lord? I didn't see you. If I had seen you, I would have done those things for you.
Right.
But I didn't see you. Well, surely I tell you, if you had done this for the least of these, you would have done it for me as well.
Right.
Which is a huge statement on how we ought to treat one another and care for each other.
Right. And is this, like, when we think about this being a parable of the kingdom of heaven, I guess part of me thinks, like, what is this story that Jesus tells? What is it intended to do? Like, what is the function of the story that he tells? Because I guess the reason I'm asking that is because there's a temptation to say, and we just did it, that there's not really much of a parable here. This isn't really a parable. He's just saying, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
There's going to be a punishment for people who didn't do this. But actually,
I like the function.
Is he doing that? Is Jesus saying, let me now describe to you exactly what's going to happen at the end times? Or is he telling a story that is supposed to do something in his listeners? Right? Because the parable is supposed to be a story that we lay alongside our lives.
Right.
That then informs how we live or how we understand what God is up to or God's kingdom or whatever. It helps us with some understanding. So maybe he is not describing, like, here's the criteria for if you've lived this way, you get to go to heaven, and if you've lived this way, you go to hell.
Yeah, I think it's been that way.
You can read it that way, right?
Yeah, and I think it has been read that way a lot, especially in...
I actually don't think it has.
No?
Well, I think, okay, sometimes yes, but I actually think more we tend to, like, I think the Christian church has more said the criteria for going to heaven or hell is, do you believe in Jesus or not? Not have you clothed the naked.
Yeah.
Right? But this seems to be a works-based righteousness, which is also really problematic, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're more comfortable with the believing in Jesus, or if we go even farther, push it even farther, we can say we're way more comfortable with it being solely dependent on the grace of God for our salvation. Like, that would be a pretty Presbyterian thing to go to. Than it is what seems to be here. Jesus seems to be saying, actually, your eternal salvation is dependent on how you treated the least of these. Jesus doesn't say anything about believing. In fact, they don't even recognize that it's Jesus. Even the righteous who get eternal fantasticness. What is the word that's used?
The righteous, just internal life.
Just life. Okay, just life.
Fantasticness.
Okay. Eternal life.
Life is fantastic.
Yeah, there you go. Like, even they don't actually know when he says, hey, you did this for me.
Right.
They're like, we don't remember doing that. He's like, you're in. That seems actually not what Christianity is taught. Christianity seems to have been like, hey, this is really all about Jesus here. Receive him so that you can receive eternal life.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think I agree with that, but that is not the statement, period, stamp, you're in. That is the entry point. of the walk of what God is desiring for humanity and for creation to be.
Right,
And I think this is...
Which is why it's helpful when you're saying this parable seems to be directed at people who are following Jesus. Who've already done that entry.
Yeah,
right?
That is true. And I think that if we might need to, like, it's always fine and wonderful when we just, focus on a tiny thing and extract whatever meaning we want to extract from it. But this is the entire chapter of 25 are a series of stories that are, then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. And we seem to have the first one of the 10 bridesmaids is the message of being prepared. And then the message of the talents or of the stewards with the money is being a good steward, and a perspective about who God is. And then this other response of servicehood, really.
Yeah.
So there might be like an overall flow of what does the Christian walk look like, or what does it look like to follow Jesus? And seeking the kingdom, that this might be the overall walk. Maybe there's one of the ways we can... What was the word you had used last week? Polyvalent?
Yeah, polyvalent meaning.
Meaning, yeah.
Yeah, so there's more than one meaning.
So one of the meanings, I'm going to argue, one of the meanings is that when we look at this as a whole about the kingdom, and what does that mean for humanity to engage with the kingdom? And in particular, for those who follow Christ,
right?
What does that look like? I think that this is kind of an example of what that looks like.
I like that. I also kind of like the framing of this story. Like if we look in verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, and then he will sit on the throne of his glory.
Yeah.
So that's the framing, right? So one way of reading it is all the people in this story are people who already follow Jesus. But that's not necessarily the case, like, because if verse 1 is actually happening, then everyone's going to see, oh.
Right.
And
this is almost like a future thought.
Yeah. Like, oh, there's the king. Like, it's now been revealed, whoever that is that's sitting on that throne over there, that's the throne over everything. We now all know that. What's interesting to me, if that's the framing of this story, it's interesting to me that there is not an immediate knowledge of, phew, I lived my life right. I'm okay. I'm going to be all right. Nor is there an immediate knowledge of, oh my goodness, it's that guy on the throne. I really messed up. Nobody actually knows. Like, it's just kind of interesting that, like, this king who comes then spells out, hey, in my kingdom, here's what was important. And some of you got it. Like, some of you actually have lived your life according to the way my kingdom is structured.
Yeah.
And some of you did not live your life according to the way my kingdom is structured. And Jesus tells the story and gives everyone inside knowledge into how the kingdom is intended to be structured.
But there's still this uncertainty of not knowing. And so I actually really like this, because there's people will say, like, there's a lot of people out there who are people of peace that desire to live a life that exemplifies love, that serves the other, that serves one another. But they balk at the church and Jesus, and because there's been so much horrible things that have happened, right? So fine. I like that, like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we're all wrong. Maybe we don't know. But if we're erring on the side of serving with love, that there is something to that when we find out. Like, my hope is that even if those people who maybe haven't followed Jesus, but they have gone and visited the sick and the poor, and they've clothed the naked, because that's a loving, kind thing to do. They didn't realize they're following Jesus, but somehow that'll be unveiled. Like, I just feel like there's some hope in that.
Well, elsewhere as well, Jesus says, not everyone who calls out Lord, Lord will be saved.
Yeah.
So, like,
it's troublesome.
It is. Yeah, and so, like, there's a real challenge here, because we don't want to slip into, like, oh, it's all about, like, what we do.
Right.
But then but then there is there's a responsibility, or there is a way that is the way of love in this world that we are intended to live. And go ahead.
I think what I also want to point to is like why we follow Jesus and why we choose to believe in Jesus. Like, people believe in all sorts of different prophets and follow teachings of all sorts of kind-hearted, wonderful human beings. But there's something different that Jesus did for us by dying on the cross, and that salvation is the crux of our faith, because we can be people of peace and not follow Jesus and still beat ourselves up because we do make mistakes and we get it wrong. And where do we encounter grace and forgiveness that wipes it all clean?
Right.
I don't know anywhere else but the cross that does that.
Right. And actually, I don't know if you looked ahead, but I was actually going to talk about that. But
no, I didn't look ahead.
So Matthew 26. So right after this, and often this is good. We're always tempted to we just got to the end of Matthew chapter 5. We're now done with the sections on some parables, and now we're moving on with the story. But Matthew on purpose told the story this way. So Matthew 26, right after this story, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days, the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified."
I'm so glad that I was led to go there and I didn't realize it. That's cool.
And one response to this, I think, and I think the disciples actually have this response, is why?
Yeah.
What?
Are you talking about Jesus?
Why would that happen? And what's interesting with what you just reflected on of how this is wiped clean and how we need that so desperately, it's almost like the answer to the why question is if you go back into the parable of the sheep and the goats, actually what Jesus describes there is actually not enough. We should, this is meant to show us that Jesus' kingdom is actually oriented around the people who are struggling and suffering, and we need to orient our service of God around the service of others.
Yeah.
But it's actually not enough. Jesus is still going to go to the cross and die and be raised again. And we have this incredible grace that God gives through that. That's this mysterious grace. We don't have time to get into atonement and how it all works right now. But yeah, I think it's enough to say it actually is not. If we make it just about how we treat others and treat them well, we actually need more than that as human beings. And I think sometimes it's tempting to say in order to get into heaven, you have to believe in Jesus, and also your faith without works is dead. So you also have to have some works, but not too much because we were Protestants, kind of send these mixed messages a little bit.
Yeah.
But if we think about human experience, we actually know that this is not enough. If we think about works, and good works are good. It actually helps other people. And it can give us a sense of fulfillment. And God actually, I think, is really pleased when we do something that's helping somebody.
Absolutely.
But we also, not just that we mess up in doing those good works, but there's so easily things that creep into it. And they are inescapable for human beings, I find. We make it about our ego, or we make it about our own advantage, or we're only doing it to feel good, or we're never feeling good, so now we're beating ourselves up and we're wearing ourselves down and we're getting burnt out and we're anxious about we do all kinds of things that mess this serving others up.
Absolutely.
And the serving others is actually not the fuel for what the true good life is. And it then becomes, actually, if you see that, I would say that as well, when the king comes, it's almost like an act of grace to those who have no clue that they've been doing the right thing all along. It's sort of this gracious king saying, "Hey, surprise everybody, you got it right. Come on in." you still have the flip side of the surprise everybody, you got it wrong. But maybe this is a grace, like maybe there's grace in this story and not a reward system. It seems like a reward system on first glance, but
yeah, it certainly can.
But maybe there's this grace.
Yeah.
And maybe the placement of Matthew putting it in the gospel in this place right before Jesus saying, okay, time to go to Jerusalem, and this whole thing is coming together with this Holy Week and the crucifixion and the resurrection. That's the focal point right now. Maybe the placement of this there is telling.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I also think about the interesting placement of this in the lectionary readings when we're about to wrap up ordinary time and move into Advent.
Yeah, well, and this is Reign of Christ Sunday as well. So it's like that's the last Sunday of the Christian year, right before Advent. So Advent kicks off the beginning of the liturgical cycle.
Right.
So yeah, Reign of Christ is why this ends up on here, because the Son of Man is coming in glory and sitting on his throne. But it is also interesting to think about, like, okay, and then the next thing we're going to talk about is there's actually more judgment texts in Advent. And it's a time of like penitential preparation. It's actually more similar to Lent than we like to think, because we usually make it about getting ready for Christmas. But it's actually preparing for the second coming, the second Advent. Advent just means appearing or showing up. And it's placed before the first Advent, which is Christmas, a celebration of the first Advent, or the first coming of Jesus, which is about incarnation. So you get like this beautiful, we have this picture at the end of the Christian year of Jesus reigning. And then what does that mean? We read that back into our lives of, well, how does that mean for how we live?
In preparing for the second coming.
And then we prepare for Jesus coming. But then the next celebration is to remember, oh, the whole point is actually that Jesus became one of us. So it's not just that Jesus is reigning on high, is coming in judgment, and so we better live in a certain way. It's no, Jesus actually was in it with us. So anyway, that's a great... We do a whole thing on the liturgical calendar and how it sort of tells that story. But
that's lovely, though.
Anyway.
All right, well, I guess we'll see where I end up on Sunday. Please join us for worship on Sunday, and we'll see what happens there. But thank you so much for your time and attention with us as we've read through this text, and have a great week.